Nigel, how is lockdown treating you?
I hate it. I mean, there's no other way of describing it. It's loathsome. Little story. I went to a pub in London last week, just off Trafalgar Square. There were 6 of us around the table, and into the pub walked somebody, well-known media figure, and sat at a table, 9, 10 feet away from me. So I got up, walked over, said, "Hi, how you doing? Nice to see you." At which a COVID marshal appeared to say, "You can't stand there and talk to him." I said, "Look, I'm just saying hello." At which he said, "Mr. Farage, please don't raise your voice." And I walked straight out of the pub. So that's one experience. Another the week before was, again, I was in London, not that I've been that much for the last 6 months. I was in a venue that was completely full. The reason is, with a 10 p.m. close, they can't do 2 sittings. So every table was full. And at 2 minutes to 10, a little alarm went to say, "Get out." And it was like a blooming rugby scrum, getting out of it. I mean, how that works with social distancing. So look, I'm personally pretty hacked off with it. I have had close members of my family that have had this thing. Some have come out the other side absolutely fine. One family member, and not a particularly old one, really had it bad. So I'm not, downplaying it. I'm not saying getting this thing is nice. But what I am saying is we've got a utterly bewildering now set of rules, which even the police chiefs, when they were questioned by a parliamentary committee, couldn't answer themselves. And I, just looking at hospitalizations, comparing them to this time last year in areas like Manchester, frankly, we've got something that in a normal year right now would be considered to be a relatively normal flu pandemic. That is in terms of numbers. And when I see that there are 35,000 people a year that die of lung cancer in this country, and that lung cancer diagnoses this year are down 75%. That's just one particular area that is now being totally overlooked in this mad long rush to make sure our hospitals are as empty as they can be in case there's an influx. And I'm, Nick, absolutely now of the view that the cure is worse than the disease. And I thought the little act of rebellion we saw from Andy Burnham this week, the mayor of Manchester, was very interesting. Now, in the end, Boris called his bluff on the money. It was quite clever politically what went on, but forget that. We've had Nicola Sturgeon trying to be even tougher with lockdown than Boris Johnson. We've had Mark Drakeford in Wales, the First Minister, shutting Wales up. And there's been a competition for who can be the toughest with lockdown. And suddenly, along comes a former cabinet minister, a very articulate guy, somebody who many thought would have been a much better leader of the Labour Party than Jeremy Corbyn was for all those years. And he goes on the Andrew Marr programme and says, "Do you know what? I think these figures are exaggerated." Now, that's a completely different approach. And I think what we're witnessing now is a change of public opinion. It may still be a small minority that think lockdown's gone too far, but it's a growing minority, and they believe it very, very strongly. And I think what Burnham has showed you is there will be further rebellions, particularly, I think, in the northeast of England, if Boris tries to lock down those areas. I think we're now beginning to get a bit of genuine resistance to lockdown. And I don't know about you, but I'm getting fewer jokes and funnies sent to me on my phone. I don't see people smiling when I'm out and about. And on the rare occasions I visit central London, it is deserted. And I tell you this, I get a very big mailbag every day on all sorts of topics. I'm not an MEP any longer. I don't represent people anymore, but I've built up connections with a lot of people in this country. And one of the commonest themes I'm getting now is from people who are self-employed, people who are sole traders, basically saying, look, the government's giving us a little bit of help, but frankly, it's a fraction of what our ongoing overheads are. And I think there is going to be not just large unemployment by Christmas, but just think on this, everybody. It's the private sector that are paying the cost of this pandemic. If you work for the civil service, you've kept your job. Your pension's guaranteed. It's those 5.5 million men and women out there that run their own businesses, that act as sole traders, that are, I think it's fair to say, in many, many cases, terrified right now that they're going to be out of business by Christmas. And so I just hope we get more voices like Andy Burnham around the country and start to have a more rational conversation. If people are vulnerable, they've got a shield. The rest of us, frankly, have got to get on with our lives.
It seems to me that every single part of the pandemic narrative and the lockdown narrative is gradually falling apart to the point where people just question, the basics of what we think we know and what our politicians are telling us. And that's one of the reasons why they respond badly to all of the different policies that are imposed now. The idea that if everyone leaves the pub at the same time at 10 o'clock, we're going to be in a scrum at the door, that was obviously going to happen. The idea that there was going to be street parties at 10:01 all over, that was obviously going to happen. The idea that there was going to be rebellions in the cities that are locked down when the rest of the country is not in lockdown, that was obviously going to happen. So it seems to me that the level of control that politicians thought they have no longer applies, but they're still trying to impose their policies anyway. Well, and if that gap gets bigger and bigger, things get dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, look, in the early part of lockdown, the government did a very good job to persuade us that we were facing something we didn't know anything about. It was a new, unseen enemy, that it could be very dangerous indeed. We'd seen what had happened in Milano and parts of northern Italy, and people respected the lockdown. But you could argue the government almost went too far in frightening us, but they did make us very effectively lock down from March the 23rd. And at the beginning of the pandemic, Boris's personal ratings were off the charts because we just left the European Union. All right, there's some quite important details still to sort out, but we just left the European Union, and he was seen at that moment by the majority of people to be acting decisively. But fast forward 6 months, and as I said earlier, not only a bewildering array of tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Oh, and isn't it amazing? Nicola Sturgeon is moving to 5 separate tiers. So I've been talking about complexity, but I think that people are beginning, and your question hints at this, people are beginning to lose respect for the rules, to question the rationale of what is going on. And if I was under 30 right now, I mean, not only would I be rebelling, and frankly, pretty much ignoring what I'm told to do, because I just would, and I think you would as well. But I would also be saying, what does this mean for me over the next 40 years? How much tax am I actually going to be charged for the rest of my working life to pay for this pandemic? So I think certainly we're going to see more rebellions amongst the youth, but my sense is we're going to see community leaders, the likes of Andy Burnham, around the country, starting to willfully and openly, not just question, but disobey government policy. And when governments lose respect, and that's different to being liked. You don't need to like a government to say, look, I don't like this law, but it's been put into place, and therefore I'm a grown up, I'm going to obey it. When people start to say, no, it's the old quote, isn't it? When laws become enemies of men, men become enemies of laws. And I think we are perilously close to that. And I think that Boris and his team need to reflect over the weekend on what Andy Burnham said and the fact that so many of his own conservative backbenchers in the northwest of England supported it. And I think the government's got to think very hard.
Do you think they will, though?
No. I mean, it seems that we're in the hands of Vallance and Whitty, the brothers Grimm, who appear on our screens every few weeks to try and frighten the pants off us and tell us it's all going to be a catastrophe. Well, they may be measuring things purely in terms of the spread of this particular virus, but we have to counterbalance that with 3 things, I think. 1, the misdiagnoses for cancer, heart disease, diabetes, a list as long as your arm. 2, we have to counterbalance it with mental health. Some of the figures coming out about the sheer percentage of people who felt depressed at some time over the course of the last few months is very disturbing. And 3, Great depressions, huge unemployment lead not just to misery, but shortened life expectancy, increased crime and disorder. And I think we're in that place too. So when and I'm not a scientist, but when I weigh up those three things against what the Brothers Grimm tell me, I think Boris needs to stop doing everything they're saying. The thing is, everybody in politics, when they get to a senior level, I know this, they're all worried about one thing: historical legacy. And what people are scared of in government, what Boris is scared of, and Hancock. I mean, I wouldn't let him wash the cars. I mean, how he's a cabinet minister in a senior position is beyond me, but there we are. But they're all worried that history will show huge numbers of people died and they didn't act. And it's that principle of fear that I think is guiding things at this moment in time. And I, from the start, we were told we're following the science. Well, how does that work? Because every scientist you meet will have a different take on how serious, the pandemic is and what the action should be. And from the start, you felt they were almost building in excuses in case it went wrong. And I think what is needed now is an act of leadership as opposed to an act of followership.
Do you think there's going to be longer term credibility issues for science, the way it's been portrayed in the media? The idea that, well, there was no consensus when we pretended there was. And I think there's going to be questions asked, about the other areas where we think there's consensus. Well, and my worry is that'll include vaccines.
Well, of course, the anti-vax movement, does have its proponents, does have its supporters, both in this country and in the USA. Now, look, I've never been an anti-vaxxer. All my children have had the right vaccinations. It seems to me that with smallpox and measles and diphtheria and many of these things, we've wiped away some of the things that plagued people's lives 100 years ago and done it remarkably well. But here's the problem. The problem is we keep being told there'll be a vaccine next Thursday, or a vaccine by Christmas, or a vaccine before the end of the winter. And I tell you what I've noticed. A lot of rational people that I've spoken to that you would not put in the anti-vaxxer group are saying, do you know what? If you expect me to take a vaccine that is fresh out of the box, effectively experimental, you've got another thing coming. And aside from the sheer logistics of vaccinating vast numbers of people, I wonder if we took a random sample of 1,000 people right now and said to them, do you want to have a vaccine next Thursday? I bet you at least half would say no. And it may even be higher than that. So the speed with which a vaccine is being developed is actually leading into this skepticism. And that is a real problem.
And it also suggests that the virus is going to be around for much longer, and we're going to have to deal with all of this in a better way than with lockdowns, which even the World Health Organization has acknowledged now.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that I've been bearish about this all the way through. It seemed obvious to me that this would happen, and wasn't it extraordinary that Dido Harding, Baroness Dido Harding, who's been put in charge of a budget on which they've now spent 12 billion on this test, track and trace system, which appears not to work, only effective in 60% of cases, which is an astonishing waste of money. And she said in late September that she was surprised at the number of people that were getting respiratory illnesses, by which she means coughs and colds. Baroness, the kids go back to school in September. It's been happening every year for centuries. I mean, you do wonder kind of what planet these people are on.